Welcome back into the B-Sides of Sports. I'm your host, Wilson Wong, alongside my co-host, Drake Howard, and this is Season 2, Episode 7 of the B-Sides of Sports. Today we're going to be talking all things NFL, so kind of taking a look at what's happened so far during the offseason, as well as kind of looking at some of the quarterback movement, and also talking about the super strange Lamar Jackson contract situation we have going on right now. So with all that being said, we're going to start with the pre-draft NFL free agency. For this exercise, Drake and I both chose a team that we thought did well, as well as a team that has done poorly so far into this NFL offseason. So Drake, do you want to start us off with the team you thought has had a really good offseason so far?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a team everyone's already expected to do good. They've really put themselves on the map the past few years, and that's the Detroit Lions. I think everything Dan Campbell has done pretty much since he's come in has been for the better. I mean, making Jared Goff look like a really competent and solid player. Not that he ever wasn't, but to just, a lot of people always wondered how much was the Rams doing and McVay's offense versus the actual success that the team had. And I think now he's kind of helped Goff show that it wasn't just McVay. And I mean, on top of that, just an explosive offense last year. They were scoring over 30 points a game easily. Now they were allowing over 30 points, and that was half the issue. That being said, I think they had, especially in the DB department, some really great signings. Cam Sutton from the Steelers, which, I mean, I've always really liked him. I think he's extremely underrated. Every Steelers corner, it just seems like they always are amazing, be it Mike Hilton, a little slot guy, or Joe Hayden. They play for forever, and they're always good, so you can never go wrong. And then I think another, again, to just keep along with this cornerback and secondary depth, they signed Emmanuel Mosley from the Niners, who's not as, I think, proven, but, I mean, playing in that system at the Niners, he's gotten so many good reps in big games, as well as just getting to play with so many talented players. So I think that's huge. And then throw in Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, and I mean, that's now one of the worst to more impressive secondaries with Okudah out there as well. I mean, they really just tried to overhaul, and I think that's what they did, as well as something I think that went a little under the radar was re-signing Marvin Jones, who I've always loved as a receiver. He's a very 800 yards, 10 touchdowns every year type of player. I've had him in fantasy quite a few years and some of the bigger leagues I do, and it's always impressive. He's also currently the only active player with 2 4-touchdown games. So that's always a little fun trivia fact I like to say. But, I mean, really just a solid player, and giving Jared Goff more options out wide, because that was their issue last year due to injuries. I mean, starting to having to throw to its third, fourth option a little more due to injuries. But with Amon-Ra St. Brown, it's just about getting more talented guys around him. And I really think that's what they did. And I mean, they re-signed a lot of key guys like Alex Anzalone, as well as CJ Moore, the DB, again, really just trying to work on that secondary. And I think it's really going to pay dividends.
Yeah, and, with Detroit, not necessarily specific to their offseason, but I really love how they closed out their season last year. They got hot towards the end. They were making a run towards the playoff. And one thing I loved that Detroit did during the last game was, even though they had no chance of getting into the playoffs, they still played the game as hard as they could, and they won. And I just think it speaks to building winning culture. And I think the offseason moves, they kind of really reinforce the direction that they're headed towards, picked up some veterans, building around their core guys that they have right there. I just really like that. I think it's kind of lost in today's sports culture where, a lot of teams, there's this debate about tanking and whether or not you want to kind of, better your odds of what you're going to get in the draft. And I think Detroit kind of doubling down and committing to winning is just an underrated move in the offseason where you don't actually really have to do anything. It's just kind of like a mindset and a culture thing. So I really like how Detroit has positioned themselves moving forward.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm big on Dan Campbell. And like you said, I think that win against Green Bay just showed the mentality that they have and the way they like to attack the ball. And it's just really cool to see a coach who really seems to care that much, especially, again, playing in a team that has historically been terrible. I mean, no Super Bowls, despite being a really historic franchise. I mean, just real shame. So to have a guy who played there, then coached there, I mean, it really just felt like a perfect match. And I think we're seeing why it was.
Absolutely. So I'll stay in division with the team whose offseason I've really liked so far this year. And that's the Chicago Bears. The Bears picked up a lot of veterans so far in the NFL offseason. They traded the number 1 pick, obviously, for wide receiver DJ Moore. And I think that's a huge addition for an offense that hasn't had a lot of explosive weapons for the young quarterback. And they got 4 draft picks out of it. So they're well set up with their draft picks heading into this year's draft. They also picked up linebackers, Tremont Edmonds and TJ Edwards, as well as a running back in Deonta Foreman, as well as picking up just a veteran quarterback in PJ Walker. I think these are all moves where you're kind of surrounding your young talent with veterans that have been around the league for a long time. And even if they're not winners, they're guys that know how to prepare themselves week in and week out. They know what to expect as, the seasons become more meaningful, and as, games down the stretch, they enter some big game moments. And I just really like that Chicago, similar to Detroit, has kind of decided to bring in the veteran guys to kind of teach their young guys how to win, and also just teach them what it's like to be a professional player in the NFL. In addition to that, I think, looking at the offseason as a whole, I think the development of Justin Fields is going to be huge for the Bears moving forward. And, the question with him, as it is with all kind of running quarterbacks, is the passing game going to be able to develop over time? And, looking at Fields and what he was able to do this season, I think it is in part because of how strong his run game is. I think a lot of it for Fields is kind of making the conscious decision to pass the ball a little bit more. He's known for holding the ball a lot, for quite long times in the pocket. And, it's something their coaches talked about with him needing to get the ball out fast. But again, I think bringing in these veterans is something that just kind of reinforces those detail things. And I just really like what the Bears are kind of building. It helps that I'm local in Chicago right now.
Yeah, little home team of sorts. But no, I agree. Especially, I think the moves at linebacker. I mean, losing Roquan, that's one of the most talented linebackers in football. So to replace him, though, with two very talented linebackers in TJ Edwards and Tremaine Edmonds, I think is also just, it's a good way to deal with a loss as massive as that, so you don't take a step back in that department. So I think that was really smart, as well as going out and getting him a true number one. I mean, DJ Moore, Darnell Mooney, and Chase Claypool, now that is a solid receiver core, as well as with Cole Kmet at tight end. I mean, really, they just have tons of talent out there, and I'm really interested, and not to mention Khalil Herbert in the backfield. They're really giving Justin Fields all the opportunity to succeed here. I think now a lot of this just falls on him.
And you mentioned, having games with Darnell Mooney and Chase Claypool. They were super injured so far with Fields. I think between the two of them, they've played maybe 10 games. And, so Fields has a really bad touchdown to interception ratio so far. I think it's 24-21 in his career. And I think having the healthy receivers as well as bringing in a true number one is really going to show us like what he's going to be able to do. Because obviously we know his completion percentage has been really bad. His passer rating hasn't been great. But those are all contextual things. And, year 3, I think, is going to be huge for him and the Bears.
Yeah, no, but now to kind of transition to the bad, starting with the Ravens. I mean, I think they're probably the easiest one to say they're bad due to everything that's happened. Not only just the Lamar Jackson trade, but they have only signed one outside free agent, being Nelson Aguilar, a solid receiver, but nothing insane. They've re-signed some. I mean, some players I personally really like Trayvon Mullen, especially. I've always really liked him as a player, but I mean, then you lose Ben Powers, a really talented O-lineman, and you haven't re-signed a lot of key players from last year. And on top of all of that, now you don't have a quarterback. So to me, it really feels like the Ravens have, I mean, all but just kind of thrown in the towel. And by tagging Lamar, they're waiting for him. And everything they do, I think, is very questionable over the last few months, which is strange because I think they're one of the better managed teams. And you look at their success, especially in recent years, having one of the best defensive units of the 2000s with very lackluster QB play. You think they'd finally be able, with that good QB, to build a winner, but they haven't. And I think a lot of that is because they got so used to winning with defense that they forgot that sometimes when you have offense, you have to invest in that just as much as you would a Super Bowl winning defense. And obviously, I always point to Lamar's lack of talent at receiver, but I mean, you'd give Ray Lewis, Ed Reed behind him, and all these guys on the D-line, signing guys like Saragusa, but you wouldn't sign one or two guys to help Lamar. Just never made much sense to me.
I'm with you. I think you laid out kind of the situation with the Ravens incredibly well, and I won't go too much in depth with my thoughts because I think a lot of it does ride with how they've kind of handled this Lamar situation. And I think we'll get to it a bit later in the pod. A lot of it might be on Lamar's shoulders too, but I'm with you. It's very questionable to me how they've never truly committed to their offense when Lamar has been and shown us that he's one of the best quarterbacks in the league. Trading away all those receivers and just kind of never going out and signing him a true number one has just been super questionable. So I also really don't like what the Ravens have done in free agency. And staying on the note of teams that have not done well, the Los Angeles Rams are the team that stick out to me. And again, a lot of it's just because of their lack of movement for not really doing anything. I think they've re-signed 2 guys, defensive tackle Marquise Copeland, as well as their offensive lineman Coleman Shelton. And Shelton has been pretty good for them. He was super versatile for them last year. He started at right guard, center, and left guard, which is quite odd. But obviously, the Rams dealt with a lot of injuries last year. I think the thing with the Rams for me, and the thing that I think they're trying to correct now, but obviously it makes for a kind of a bad offseason, is they are kind of feeling the consequences of pushing in all the chips and going all in. And, there's an interesting point to be made whether or not it's worth it to push in all the chips to win a title. I think it is, especially when you actually get to the top and win the Super Bowl, which the Rams obviously did. And to me, that's just part of, a lot of sports is about the peaks and the valleys. And to me, I would say it's more enjoyable to be at the top when you've been at the bottom, sustained runs of dynastic. Obviously, it's fun for the team that's actually experiencing that. But I think for the average fan, we kind of enjoy more of the ups and downs of winning and losing in sports. And I think the Rams right now are kind of experiencing this corrective period, right? Their GM, Les Snead, came out and was talking about how the Rams are kind of pressing the brakes this offseason. And they're kind of, seeing the consequences of foregoing their draft picks for veteran talent. Obviously, they traded away Jalen Ramsey. And I think as they're rebuilding their roster, I think the approach that they're taking with rebuilding through the draft is the one they have to take, because at one point you can't just keep maxing out their credit card and just signing veteran guys year in and year out. You have to build something a little more sustainable, and I think that's what they're going to try to do this offseason.
No, I think that's a good point, especially it really expresses the mentality they had, which is, again, they weren't trying to build a dynasty. They were trying to win a Super Bowl, which I think is fine. I know some people are kind of against that style of building a roster, but I mean, you see it a lot in the NBA as well. Again, the Raptors did it. And again, I disagree with it in some instances, but I understand it. Sometimes it's just nice to win that first one, even if you are overcommitting and screwing yourself over a little bit, because, I mean, for so many teams, especially a team like the Lions, I mean, I feel like even if they just won one Super Bowl, or the Browns, that would be enough to just give fans and ownership, enough of a break to where they could get a reset and kind of change the culture. So I completely understand it from the Rams perspective, but like the GM said, just having to take a step on the brakes, that's natural. They're going to have Stafford back at 100% though, supposedly. So, obviously there's still good days ahead, I think, for them. Stafford's a very talented quarterback, but yeah, I just think it's about time, that, you have to pay the fee at some point. It's like you said, it's like a credit card. Saints have experienced it, and, they're still dealing with it. And so at some point, you have to pay the piper. And I think that's just kind of what they're doing right now.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes also, these teams can trick themselves into thinking they can do it over and over. I think the Rams have had the self-awareness to realize that they can't do that. I think last year kind of rang the alarm for them, and they kind of realized, we're sitting at 4-12, 5-12, or whatever their record was. Obviously this isn't sustainable. We're going to have to kind of relook and reanalyze how we want to approach the free agency period. So I think they've had a bad free agency, but I think it's the right move for them.
Yeah. And again, very similar to, like I said, with the Saints, where they're both teams that kind of have tried to overhaul their rosters last few years with a lot of change. Rams being changed at quarterback and running back, while the Saints have had to change at quarterback. And so you're just seeing these drastic changes. And speaking of drastic changes, that kind of works to push us into the second part of this show, where we're talking about the ongoing quarterback carousel that we saw this offseason. And speaking of the Saints, one of the teams Wilson especially wanted to talk about was Derek Carr and the Saints, and what he kind of thinks of that match, as well as, how well he thinks it fares versus other ones. So.
Yeah, and so, with the Saints, very similar to the Rams, I think the Saints have kind of truly utilized this kind of maxing the credit card strategy. And it's something I really enjoy listening to NFL and NBA analyst on Fox, Nick Wright. And he's talked a lot about how the Saints have kind of really bought into this idea of just using dead money off the cap. And, they sign these guys to huge deals, they front load the money, then they backload the money. And it's really just this kind of eternal kind of avoidance of realizing that you're not a true contender. And I think signing Derek Carr is in many ways similar to this. The Saints obviously haven't looked great since Drew Brees has left, and they're kind of dealing with a lot of guys that are older, a lot of guys that are injury prone. And so we haven't really seen the Saints at full strength and what their roster could be. And they went ahead and doubled down again. They're going to try to commit to winning by signing the 32-year-old veteran quarterback, Derek Carr. And so kind of looking at the fit on the roster, because I kind of wanted to take a step back and see if maybe I was being a little too harsh on the Saints and their strategy, especially in the weaker NFC. And we know that division is not great. Carr's been great. He's had 28 fourth quarter comebacks to his name throughout his career. No one in the NFL has had more since he arrived to the NFL in 2014. So he's been clutch. And then obviously when we just kind of consider the situations he had with the Raiders, not very consistent at their head coach position, their offensive coordinators, dealt with a lot of different receivers, dealt with a lot of different controversies, and his defenses have never been great with the Raiders. So kind of going to the Saints, it's kind of a different situation. The Saints have been a model organization, super consistent, super sustainable, as well as having a really good defense. And while I'm not the highest on Dennis Allen as a head coach, I do think, he's good for their defense. And when I gave some consideration to the offensive weapons the Saints are going to have at their disposal, obviously Chris Olave is coming off of a great rookie season at 72 catches for over 1,000 yards. Quietly, Rashid Shaheed had 488 receiving yards. I really like him as a young and upcoming player for them. And then we know Michael Thomas, Alvin Kamara, if these guys are healthy, they're going to be pretty good offensively. Speaking about free agency, they quietly picked up Jamal Williams, who was a touchdown machine this past year. I really like that signing. I thought I wouldn't like the move when I first heard about it, but after giving it some consideration, I think if everyone's healthy, they have a shot to win that division, and after that, anything can happen. So I think it's an okay move for them.
Yeah, no, and I think that's kind of I'm glad you touched on it. It was always mind-boggling to me the lack of defense that the Raiders had under Carr. Under Carr, their best defense overall was ranked 20th. And never having one again higher than that. And they had a bottom 3 ranked defense 3 times while Derek Carr was a starting quarterback. So I really just think that speaks to all the issues that were out of Derek Carr's control. And the 1 year they finally looked good. I remember the game so well when Jack Del Rio was their head coach. They're 12-4. They were 11-4 going into the last week of the year. They play the Colts. And Derek Carr broke his leg playing the Colts because they were up, I think, 3 touchdowns late in the third, and they kept him in. He broke his leg. It always just kind of felt like that match was never going to work, but they kept trying so hard, and they gave up draft picks for John Gruden, and then that didn't work. And like I said, Jack Del Rio, I mean, he just never had any stability at head coach. And like you said, I'm not big on Dennis Allen either, but what I am big on is the Saints defense. It seems like especially the last 4 seasons, always a top 10 unit. And I mean, I think a lot of that's from some of the players like Marshawn Lattimore or Cameron Jordan, just really talented roster, as well as now having a bevy of talent at receiver with Michael Thomas coming back and Chris Olave, who I just love, bringing Jamal Williams back to kind of mirror what they did with Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara a few years back when they both made the Pro Bowl. Was that 1-2 punch where Kamara's not a great true runner, but Williams is, but Kamara's great at catching, right? So it's that 1-2 punch to play off each other. I think they've put Derek Carr in a position where they've given him as good a chance to succeed. If he can't win on a roster like this, or at least, take him deep into the playoffs, I just don't think it's going to happen for him.
I love the way you laid everything out there. And, to go to this Carr point, I think when we hear about Derek Carr, a lot of the time we hear he's somewhere in that, for ranking quarterbacks, somewhere in that 8 to 16 range, essentially saying that he's not one of the game's most elite, but he's obviously above average. And any team would be, unless you have a Mahomes, an Allen, a Burrow, a Hurts, you'd love to have him as your starting quarterback. And to me, I think when we go back to considering, how the Saints will compete, especially within the NFC, I like Derek Carr as a top 3 quarterback in that conference right now. When we think about the powerhouse quarterbacks right now, most of them do live in the AFC. If we're talking about top quarterbacks in the NFC, obviously Hurts is coming off an amazing run, but in terms of a veteran presence, I like Carr more than I like a Kirk Cousins or even a Dak Prescott. And so, to me, I think the quarterback play, in addition to the weapons, and if the defense can keep doing what it's been doing, you kind of have to like the Saints going into next year. I would kind of put them in that like Cinderella run category, right? You wouldn't call them a true contender going into the year, but it feels like if they made it happen, you wouldn't be shocked. It'd be kind of surprising, but you can kind of see the model and the framework.
Yeah, I'd say kind of akin to the Giants of this year, where kind of everything fell into place when they got the coach. This might be that circumstance, but instead of coach, it comes in the form of quarterback and Derek Carr. And then to move on to the next one, the person replacing Derek Carr, at least for now, Jimmy Garoppolo. Obviously, Jimmy Garoppolo has been the Niners quarterback for the last few years, taking them to an NFC championship and a Super Bowl with some just very consistent play. But now, as we sit here and being replaced by the 7th-round miracle, Brock Purdy, Jimmy G had to go, and where he went was to fill in for old Derek Carr and play for his old offensive coordinator, Josh McDaniels Wilson. What do you think of this move, just top to bottom?
Well, and so the Jimmy G stuff is super interesting, and I think the general media has talked about Jimmy G a lot more than you and I maybe have, but, I think he's a very controversial guy for a lot of reasons, and I think we just have to start with the fact that Jimmy G is very much branded as a winner. But I think if you ask the average NFL guy, like, do you really think Jimmy G is like a quality NFL starter? I think you're going to get a lot of different opinions. And, to me, I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. Obviously, I think he's won about 70% of his games as an NFL starting quarterback. He's made it to a Super Bowl. He's been into NFC title games. And that being said, I would attach it with the caveat that he's always been on great rosters. and the situations in which he's done those things, obviously he's been aided by a lot of things, right? The greatest coach of all time in Belichick, arguably, and then he's on these loaded Niners rosters over the last couple of years. You want to give him some of the credit, but you don't want to give him all of the credit. And to me, I've always liked the intangibles of Jimmy G a little bit more than what I've actually seen on the field. I think the guys in the locker room really believe in him. They really like him. Everyone says he's a great leader. And I also think culturally, and this is kind of funny thing to think about, but I think culturally he really fits in Vegas, right? Like, Jimmy G just seems like the type of guy that could walk around Las Vegas and really fit in. And so, for what it's worth, I really like that. Now, that being said, on the field, I do have a lot of concerns. Obviously, we're pairing him with one of the game's greatest deep weapons in Davante Adams, and Jimmy G is historically bad at throwing the deep ball. He hardly does it. He's not great at it. And I think we've seen it in the offenses that he was under with the Patriots and the Niners. He's not really a guy that you give the ball down the stretch and just tell him to throw every possession. And, if it's 3rd and long, I don't really trust him to make the throw. So for all those things, I like the fit, but I don't think it's the long-term answer for what the Raiders are trying to build.
No, I think that's a good point. And I will say I do not like Jimmy Garoppolo. I think from what it sounds like more than you. But what I will say is Kyle Shanahan's offense is very West Coast offense, which is relying on your playmakers to make a play rather than taking deep shots. Less of, like what the Eagles are doing, and way more of what the old Niners did, or what his dad did, Mike Shanahan, where it's a lot more of intermediate completions and shorter completions and having talent at those positions. He's had guys like Deebo Samuel, his dad had Ed McCaffrey, right? Just so these kind of, different guys and finding the best ways to use them. Obviously, Deebo and McCaffrey were very different, but what Shanahan's offense always does, and what I feel like it does better than maybe anyone's in the league, is it finds ways to give the best player the ball. Obviously, Deebo Samuel's a runner. They give him straight up running plays or screens. Ed McCaffrey, who's just a freak of nature, he's so tall. They give him a ton of high point passes and things that other guys just couldn't get to. So it's all about that optimization, and that's why I think I'm going to be interested to see Jimmy with Davante Adams, one of the best deep ball guys in the league as far as a receiver, with someone who hasn't thrown barely any. And his probably most famous throw is a missed deep ball to Emmanuel Sanders in the Super Bowl. So I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I'm definitely hesitant on that, but it's more of my lack of confidence in Josh McDaniels than it is my lack of confidence in Jimmy G, because for whatever reason, the guy just wins games.
I think that's fair. And, I'm on the record on how high I was on the AFC West last year. And obviously, they are playing in a division that, although the Broncos kind of had a disappointing year, I think a lot of people are crediting, the addition of Sean Payton as probably going to be a difference maker. The Broncos are going to look a lot different than they did this past year. And so, we're looking at that division again, and it is loaded, but the Raiders are also loaded, right, on talent. They've got guys on defense. They've got, just playing Max Crosby, Chandler Jones. They've got a really nice kind of roster up and down. And, to me, they're putting Jimmy G in a good position again. But when you look at kind of just the talent that still exists in the AFC West, again, I go back to, I don't think Jimmy G is the difference maker, right? Like, I think he's a guy that, and you mentioned it, like when put into the right system can contribute to winning. I don't think he's the sole reason for it. And so, for all those things, again, this is a move that I really like, but I don't necessarily think it puts the Raiders over the top. That being said, I think it's going to be a lot of fun football in that division again. I think we're probably going to see some closer divisional games than we've seen in the past. That's being said, maybe it bites me again. I could be wrong on the AFC West again, but.
Yeah, no. And so then to just wrap up kind of the quarterback carousel, the last one we wanted to touch on, well, me in particular, was Gardner Minshew. I've always been a fan of Gardner Minshew. I'll be up front. I made a video about him a few years ago. I've just always liked, he's just definition of a football guy. And I think you really see that, especially in, you just hear all these crazy stories about him, be it the one in college where he tried to break his hand so he could be a medical redshirt, or, the jorts and the mustache and, playing in his bowl games despite being draft eligible. Just a guy who loves football and has played good football at the highest level in the NFL. I mean, through his first 2 years at Jacksonville with terrible Jacksonville teams, he looked like a competent quarterback. Statistically speaking, you can make an argument that through 2 years, he was better than Trevor Lawrence with just as much roster instability and not with Doug Peterson, who I've always loved as a head coach. So I think you throw all that in, and then you look at him in Philly over the last 2 years. He's played really solid. He's his yards per game have gone up, as well as his completion percentage. He's looked more older and more matured. So I really think with the Colts most likely not getting one of the more proven guys in Stroud or Young, because presumably they'll go before. If they get a guy like Richardson or Levis, God forbid, or someone else similar to that, Hendon Hooker, just a guy of that caliber who might need a little more time, I think Gardner Minshew provides a great cushion, as well as this is a chance for him. Let's say he balls out and he plays amazing. He could become a Jacoby Brissett of sorts, where he becomes a respected guy around the league, or Case Keenum as a backup, or hey, Geno Smith became a starter this year. I mean, I really think the world is your oyster, and it's not only because I'm a Colts fan. I've always been high on Minshew, and I just think the Colts kind of give him that chance one more time, right? Very few guys get second chances in the NFL. It's just kind of the way the business works. If you don't work somewhere, teams just kind of assume you won't work at all. So I always like when I see guys get second chances, and I'm glad that what he did in Philly has kind of shown that he deserves at least one more chance to really try and command an offense. And I'm really, honestly, more than a Colts fan, I'm excited as a Gardner Minshew fan at what the future may hold for him now that he's got a chance to be presumably, again, we don't know for sure, but presumably the week 1 starter.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you're more familiar with Minshew's game over, the last couple of years than I am. I had to, kind of do a deep dive into how he played in Jacksonville. And I was very surprised to see, he looked very good, albeit in like limited playing time, especially last year with Philadelphia. But for what it's worth, there are a couple things I really like. First, obviously, he's reuniting with his old offensive coordinator and Shane Steichen. Obviously, that's something that counts for something. And, we always hear about guys and how much nepotism and relations play a role and how they fit in the league and just kind of that dynamic in locker room. So I really like that part of it. And for what it's worth, Minshew himself seems to be ecstatic to be in Indianapolis. He talked about how much he's excited to play under Shane again. And he even mentioned how much he likes how Chris Ballard's building teams. And so, again, I think it's small things, but I think those things matter in kind of, just the outlook for this upcoming season. And, if he's excited to be there, I hope guys in locker room are too. And, you had a rough quarterback situation last year. I hope to see him as the week 1 starter for sure.
Yeah, me too. I definitely think it's something that is going to be nice for Colts fans, because for the first time in now quite some time, they have a really young guy in there at QB. I mean, I know Carson Wentz wasn't super old, but I mean, I just think the fact of the matter with Gardner Minshew not even being 27 years old is, I mean, that's a guy getting into ready to play some of his best football of his career, not a guy on his way out. So I just think that's different than what the Colts have done, where they were signing these veterans, trying to, get these guys past their glory days to win. Now they're getting a guy who could potentially have his best days in front of him.
Absolutely. And the fact that you guys got him for, I think it was $3.5 million. I mean, It seems like kind of a steal, honestly, considering you mentioned, he is still very young and he does have kind of a lot of talent. So again, super excited to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, for sure. But now to kind of go into our last thing, keeping on the trend of quarterbacks. I mean, that's just, what the game is nowadays, but the Lamar Jackson situation. Now, obviously, we kind of all know roughly what's going on, but I'm first going to lay down some foundation and just some things I think about it. So for starters, I think what makes this so unique compared to a lot of the other quarterback situations that have happened in the past few years is that they placed the non-exclusive franchise tag on him. Now, my senior year of high school, I did a paper where I read countless books about the salary cap and how it works, different types of tags. And it was for my AP English class. So I did tons of research. I read 3 books just about the salary cap. So I have a pretty good idea on how some of this stuff goes. And I will say what's very interesting about this is the non-exclusive franchise tag doesn't happen often. The last time famously it happened was Kirk Cousins. Now, what the non-exclusive franchise tag is it's not as much money as the franchise tag. The franchise tag this year is around $45 million, fully guaranteed, while the non-exclusive tag is 32.4, which is funny because even in not paying Lamar and letting him find money, they're paying him less. It's just kind of an ultimate irony. Like the Ravens just don't want to pay him for whatever reason, right? And so, but the non-exclusive tag, what makes it unique is he can go out and negotiate with any team. But the issue is once he negotiates with them, they also have to give up 2 first-round picks. Now, this wasn't as much of an issue years and years and years ago when there were still poison pill contracts. Now, what a poison pill contract is teams would put clauses in the deal that a team like the Ravens couldn't match, so they could get Lamar. So then they maybe wouldn't have to pay him so much money, and the team couldn't match, so they could just get the deal on and move. Because now, obviously, the thought is, okay, let's say Lamar's okay with signing for 175 million guaranteed with the Dolphins because he wants to go play there and they actually have weapons. He could do that, but then the Ravens could just match it and bring him back on a deal that he doesn't want. So that's kind of the tricky thing for Lamar, is that he's really just the one getting screwed over more than anyone. And I kind of brought up the concept of a poison pill contract that was banned in the two CBAs ago, collective bargaining agreement, which the NFL Players Union and the NFL owners signed. So you cannot do that anymore. Famously, Steve Hutchinson, the guard, this contract came into play when he was playing for the Vikings, when they placed the tender on him. The Seahawks sent him a deal. Or sorry, vice versa. He was playing for the Vikings. Seahawks put a deal the Vikings couldn't match. They didn't like it, so then they got all mad. And then the collective bargaining agreement are prohibited from doing it now. So he can't get out that way. So that then gives his only out to if a team really wants him. But then that team has to give up 2 first-round picks. So the team has to be set up foundationally enough to the point where they can support a team without 2 of the most valuable draft picks. I think the first and second round and early third are some of the most valuable picks. The top 100 talent in the NFL usually it's a big dip off of that. 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round, usually don't hear so much about. It's usually those first 3 rounds, I feel like, is that you're getting a guaranteed talent even if they don't work out, right? So you're giving all of that up, and as well as the hundreds of millions, and he wants guarantees, which I think is warranted. But again, I think that's fair for him to want $230 million in guarantees. But the issue is, if the Browns don't offer Deshaun Watson one of the most absurd contracts in NFL history, being 5-year, $230 million guaranteed, they're already struggling with this contract. I'm not sure if you saw this. In the offseason, they've already had to restructure this deal. So for 2024, 25, and 26, they have a $63 million cap hit on Deshaun Watson because an NFL roster is not built to give either fully guaranteed rosters or one that are comparable to non-guaranteed rosters of other top quarterbacks. That's the issue. A guy who hadn't played in a year and a half, coming off a major injury with 25 active ongoing lawsuits against him. The Browns once again showed their lack of knowledge at quarterback in a way I didn't even think possible by signing a guy to a deal that he arguably didn't deserve. And I think it just shows that the Browns, and I don't want to give them credit. A lot of people are like, maybe they did it to screw over the Ravens. The Browns are not smart enough to do that. I truly believe that. Look at their history at QB. They have so much foundational problems. I can't even begin to start. This was just the Browns being stupid and overpaying a guy to get him. Kind of what I think the Broncos just did with Sean Payton. They were so scared of not having any other alternative that they overpaid the crap out of a guy, traded a bunch of picks for him just because they wanted someone. It's that fear of the quarterback, which is, I wrote my senior AP paper on that because it's such a real phenomenon, and you saw it there, and now Lamar Jackson's getting screwed because of it, and I think that's the dumbest part of it. The NFL Players Union encourages players to chase as much money as possible. And I think that's understandable. But then you see instances like this where Deshaun Watson, where he undeservedly, in my opinion, asked for all of this money, having not played, having been, as what a judge officially ruled in court, exhibiting predatory behavior to multiple individuals. To pay him all of that money sets a bad precedent, because then you have a guy who's already won an MVP, had just as much instability on the team around him as Deshaun Watson did, but I think not nearly as good of weapons. He didn't have DeAndre Hopkins. He didn't have a J.J. Watt on his team. And to do what he did and then not be able to get paid because of what the Browns did, I think that to me is the most tragic part. Because don't get me wrong, Lamar obviously could ask for more money, and I think that'd be fair. But the Ravens' unwillingness to pay him, if I'm Lamar Jackson, I don't want to play there. Which, if they just placed the franchise tag on him, that would be totally fine. He could trade and sign, but they didn't. They placed a tag on him that handcuffed him wrongfully, and I think unethically. And that's, I think, my biggest issue with this, is they did kind of a sleazy, backhanded way. And I know technically the franchise tag is allowed and all these other variations of it, but still, that doesn't change my perspective on how ethical I think they are, as well as just the issue of, like I said, they're really handcuffing him. If he wanted to go to a team and let them pay him less, because again, they might have weapons for him, they might support him better. He can't do that physically because the Ravens would match it. He would have to go to the Ravens and request that they don't match it. But again, if he only then takes a discount, the Ravens of course are going to sign him. They just didn't want to give all of the money he wanted. So even if he goes on a discounted deal or a smaller deal, the Ravens could just match it and he's screwed. And he has to play for a team that he doesn't want to play for. And unless he wants to sit out and void all the guaranteed money, which is dumb and sucks. I mean, to me, it really just seems like the Ravens did this about as backhanded as they could. And I think it's just very disrespectful the president is sent, as well as I think, again, maybe just as large of an issue was the Deshaun Watson contract. I mean, you're already seeing the Browns struggle with it, like I pointed out. So I think it's just kind of a sucky situation. I always hate to see talented players in situations like this. It reminds me of Le'Veon Bell a few years ago with the Steelers holding out, because then you're missing out on some of the best football you can watch. And you hate to see it. And so I really just hope something gets solved. I don't know what that will be. I don't have a solution to this. This is just kind of more of a rant more than anything, but I just really hope something happens.
Yeah, I think you did a really great job of laying out kind of what is kind of unfolded and why the situation is so gross to even kind of consider, just knowing the things that we know about Deshaun. I want to say first, like, it's incredible that the agent was able to negotiate that contract for Deshaun, right? Like, you put a lot of that on the Browns. I think it's disgusting, but props to the agent, because I never would have seen that coming. And the other thing that makes this Lamar thing and the comparison to Deshaun so puzzling to me is that the Ravens had the opportunity to extend Lamar even before that contract was signed. And so because of that, that's where I kind of just get so confused, because I don't understand why the Ravens don't want a proven quarterback in today's era, which we have talked about a lot during this episode, where the quarterback play is so integral. And what we've seen with Lamar is he's shown the ability to get better. I understand that the injuries are a concern, but to me, I just really don't understand why the Ravens seem like they don't want a guy who many other teams should want. And then even more puzzling is why these other teams also aren't picking up the phone to call about Lamar. I mean, altogether, I really don't understand kind of the league's perception of Lamar. It makes me wonder if there are, things that we don't know, the general public, things that we don't know about the Lamar situation. And I will also say, I think Lamar himself can probably handle the situation a little bit better. Obviously, he's made a big deal about wanting to represent himself, which I'm all for. But at the same time, I think it kind of undercuts his value when he's not bringing in a professional to kind of negotiate for him, as well as just kind of the way he's handled everything through the media. Obviously, he has his own production company. Obviously, we haven't heard anything on that end yet, so that's not going great. There's been a lot about the guys that he's brought in to kind of do the negotiating for him. We've seen the CBA release statements about it. Again, I don't want to put any of it on Lamar, because I think it's more of an indictment on the Ravens, but I do think Lamar could do a couple things to help him out here.
Yeah, and again, I hear what you're saying, but again, I always just hate to gang up on the little guy in this scenario. And like you said about the NFL releasing statements about that Ken guy who we made the all-in-one gym with, and they're like, do not negotiate with him. And then Lamar had to come out public and be like, hey, he was not trying to negotiate for me. You're just lying now. And as well as, there's been rumors of collusion. So I just think that's kind of the hard thing is, as fans, we only get so much information. And again, you brought up, well, he also doesn't negotiate with an agent. But I also understand that just as much as well. I wouldn't want someone taking a cut. I worked my whole life to make all this money, and now all of a sudden you're telling me I have to pay someone who's going to take X amount off. Like, I've always understood that. Richard Sherman famously did it. Trent Williams, the Pouncey brothers, I'm pretty sure, also negotiated their contracts on their own. And like I said, I more than understand that. And so I think you're right with Lamar could present himself better, but Lamar has always been Lamar to a T. I mean, his social media is one of the most wild things, and I love it. It's awesome. The league needs players like him. And just to kind of touch on the last point you brought up, which is you need that proven quarterback, especially in the AFC, I think you're right. And now with Mahomes winning last year with over $40 million cap hit and being almost 20% that shatters the record. The highest cap hit of a quarterback had before Patrick Mahomes was around 13%, and it was Steve Young and Tom Brady. Now that has been shattered with almost a quarter of it being on one player. So I think that era of not being able to pay your quarterback has faded, as we've seen, I think maybe at least for the present era, until rules change or something, we may have seen the end of these sort of game managers winning it all for you, because I just think when you get to that top level, look at teams like San Fran, right? They did it. They made it all the way, but they had more of a game manager, and look what happened. He had to make a few big plays, and he couldn't against Mahomes and the Chiefs. So I just think football is changing, and I think the Ravens are stuck in their old ways.
Absolutely. And I think you did such a great job laying that out. I think that's a good place to kind of leave our episode for today. To all the viewers out there, thank you guys for tuning in. Drake and I are super excited to get video on board. Obviously, we're going to have stuff up on different social media outlets as well as just a YouTube channel. So we're super excited for this next phase of the podcast. If you guys like it, we'd love if you subscribe, leave a comment, leave a review. Anything you can help us to get better. It's a journey for all of us. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.